In the pitch-black, crushing depths of the ocean, the military didn't just find physics, they found phantoms. Let's jump right into this explainer, where we're opening up the declassified logs of the absolute unknown. We usually think of military records as, well, pretty dry, right? Bureaucratic accounts of troop movements, supply chains, that kind of thing. But hidden inside these official archives are meticulously detailed logs of what happens when human beings are pushed way past the limits of our biology, straight into a realm of pure dread. We're going to dig into declassified documents and medical journals to see exactly how Naval and Air Force clerks captured the terrifying realities of the unexplained.
So what actually happens when human physiology crosses into the unknown? Before we can really grasp the extraordinary anomalies buried in these logs, we've got to look at the severe limits of our own bodies under immense pressure. Think about it. Long before we were looking up at the sky or venturing into the vacuum of space, humans were descending into the crushing darkness of the ocean. And they were doing it armed with nothing but primitive air pumps and a profoundly terrifying lack of medical knowledge. They were just utterly unprepared for the violence of the deep.
Just listen to the sheer helplessness in this historical account. Of the seasoned divers, not a man escaped the repeated attacks of rheumatism and cold. Back in the 1840s, British Royal Engineers were going down into 65 feet of water wearing these heavy, primitive hard hats, completely unaware that they were triggering a physiological nightmare that would haunt deep-sea exploration for decades. Their job was to clear out a shipwreck that was blocking the anchorage at Portsmouth, working up to 7 hours a day in total darkness. As the historian notes here, every single seasoned diver suffered horribly from what they ominously called the mysterious malady. Which brings us to Section 1, the mysterious malady. Let's look at how this builds into an investigation of a literal, invisible killer.
It took decades of absolute agony during massive engineering projects, think like the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, to finally realize what was actually happening to these men. Workers in pressurized underwater chambers, known as caissons, were being struck down by dizzy spells, sharp pains, paralysis, and even death. They were literally bent over in sheer agony, which led to the grim nickname, the Benz, or caisson disease. It wasn't until 1878 that a French physiologist named Paul Bert realized the culprit wasn't a pathogen and it wasn't the cold. It was the very air they were breathing.
The true horror of this condition, venous gas embolism, is that it literally causes your blood to bubble if you surface too fast. It all comes down to Henry's law. When you're breathing air under high pressure, your body tissues absorb massive amounts of nitrogen. If you rush to the surface, that sudden drop in pressure causes all that dissolved nitrogen to violently come out of solution at once, forming gas bubbles right inside your bloodstream. It's exactly like ripping the cap off a violently shaken bottle of soda. Those bubbles block blood flow, they ravage the nervous system, and they trigger catastrophic, agonizing organ failure.
And you can see on this table just how unpredictable and devastating these bubbles are. Look at the sheer variety of symptoms. Nearly 90% of victims get hit with agonizing local joint pain, but things can escalate wildly to what early divers called the staggers, which is extreme dizziness, or even progress to paralysis and total collapse. The human body was essentially tearing itself apart from the inside out simply because it moved between environments way too quickly.
Moving on to Section 2, Admiralty logs and casualties. You might be wondering how we know so much about these specific horrors today.
Well, it all comes down to the grim, dry bureaucracy of naval record-keeping. The British Admiralty obsessively cataloged every gruesome death and medical anomaly in these specific declassified logs. Across series like ADM 104 and ADM 101, naval doctors were recording standard battle casualties right alongside these terrifying new environmental deaths. There's this fascinating kind of eerie contrast here, right? You have the surreal, internal suffering of a diver whose blood is quite literally boiling with nitrogen, contrasted against a naval clerk meticulously logging it all into an official register. But inside ADM 261, alongside those standard casualties, these doctors began recording something else entirely. Terrifying, uniform hallucinations that utterly defied medical explanation. Let's explore how they tried to stop this in Section 3, Haldane and the Goats.
By 1905, the Royal Navy had seen enough suffering. They needed to stop this invisible killer, so they commissioned a brilliant physiologist named John Scott Haldane. Haldane figured out that nitrogen is actually 5 times as soluble in fat as it is in water. To map out exactly how long tissues take to desaturate, he did something kind of wild. He built a compression chamber and subjected goats to extreme pressures, deliberately giving them the bends. Why goats? Well, their body mass to cardiac output ratio actually made them a surprisingly decent stand-in for the humans braving those agonizing depths.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive paradigm shift in diving physiology. Before Haldane, Paul Burt had advocated for a steady, continuous, slow ascent. Sounds logical, but divers were still dying. Haldane realized you could actually cut the absolute pressure in half rapidly without any ill effects, but then you had to deliberately stop. He created what we call stage decompression, stopping at very specific depths for mathematically calculated amounts of time to let the nitrogen safely vent from the lungs before moving any higher.
And it worked brilliantly. Using Haldane's mathematically precise tables, a human test subject, Lieutenant Dumont, successfully dove to an astonishing 210 feet, or 35 fathoms, without a single symptom. Just like that, Haldane's tables virtually eliminated decompression sickness in the Royal Navy, completely revolutionizing humanity's ability to survive the deep ocean.
But as we'll see in Section 4, Rapture of the Deep, surviving the physical pressure didn't protect the mind.
Fixing the bubbles in the blood, that was really only half the battle, because there was an entirely different, intoxicating threat waiting in the dark. Discovered by Albert Benke in 1935, nitrogen narcosis is essentially deep water intoxication. When you breathe compressed air below 99 feet, the nitrogen stops acting as just a physical hazard and becomes a profound neurological one. It creeps in, altering perception and reality itself. This is the exact same bizarre psychological phenomenon that famously nearly cost Jacques Cousteau his life in a pitch-black underwater cave.
Nitrogen completely hijacks your consciousness, a state divers ominously call the rapture of the deep. But diving into those medical logs from 1906 onward reveals something far more terrifying than just poor judgment. We're talking about the bends of the dead. Hundreds of independent deep-sea salvage divers, surfacing from wrecks across totally unconnected oceans, reported the exact same hallucination, a figure standing on the seafloor, always watching them ascend. The accounts, cross-referenced between U.S. Navy Experimental Diving Unit records and that sealed 1941 appendix in ADM 261, are structurally identical. It happened in the same depth range. The figure was always below them, never above. And it never moved until the divers stopped looking. It was so uniform across divers with zero prior contact that the examining physician noted this convergence, quote, exceeds what oxygen deprivation alone is known to generate in otherwise healthy subjects. The raw transcripts remain held at the Institute of Naval Medicine in Gosport, never publicly released. It was the one experience every professional pre-scuba diver was warned about, statistically likely to encounter and officially told to ignore. A physiology that can explain hallucination, but absolutely cannot account for why, across a century of independent reports, whatever they saw at depth was always, without exception, already looking up at them.
Which brings us to Section 5, Rendlesham, an official anomaly. So what happens when military records document an altered state of consciousness that isn't caused by the internal physics of the deep ocean, but by an unexplained external environment? In late December 1980, near the twin NATO bases in Rendlesham Forest, a bizarre event took place that is permanently immortalized in the official Ministry of Defense archives. After encountering a glowing metallic object in the dark woods, USAF Airman John Burroughs gave this official deposition. Everything seemed like it was different when we were in that clearing. It was like a weird feeling, like everything seemed slower than you were actually doing. Notice that sensory distortion, time slowing down, the environment warping? It is eerily similar to the psychological dread and distortions of the bends of the dead, underwater. But this was happening on dry land, induced by something entirely outside of himself.
Now, what's really fascinating about this is what happened the next day. Military investigators checked the ground where the object had hovered and found 3 physical depressions in the Earth emitting 0.1 milliroentgens of beta and gamma radiation. And get this, who did the Ministry of Defense consult to confirm these abnormal readings? The exact same radiation experts at the Institute of Naval Medicine in Gosport who safeguard the raw transcripts of those terrifying deep-sea diving logs. They confirmed this reading was 10 times the normal background radiation for that specific area.
And this wasn't just some fleeting encounter by a single, terrified patrol. The deputy base commander himself, Lieutenant Colonel Charles I. Halt, took a team out 2 nights later and recorded an audio tape live as the anomalies returned. He officially submitted this tape along with a formal memo to the MOD. Listen to his almost biological description of this mechanical object. It looks like an eye winking at you, a dark center. It's a bit like a pupil of an eye looking at you. It literally cements an utterly inexplicable, eerie event right into the official archives, nestled in the very same bureaucratic systems that track naval supplies and hospital musters.
Both of these instances really showcase how military organizations meticulously catalog the exact moments our fragile human biology collides with the unimaginable. On one hand, you have internal anomalies, like the bends and narcosis, producing unified, terrifying visions of figures watching from the deep. On the other hand, you have external anomalies, like Rendlesham, warping time and leaving physical radioactive traces behind in a dark forest. In both cases, the human observer is basically the primary instrument registering a horrifying extreme environment.
The records we've explored in this explainer prove that reality is profoundly stranger than fiction. The most intense encounters are often quietly filed away in sealed appendices and defense memos. I leave you with this final thought. If the military has systematically documented the violent bubbling of our blood, shared inexplicable hallucinations of figures watching us from the abyss, and glowing objects warping our reality in the dead of night, what other terrifying truths are sealed in those archives, just waiting for us to look down?